Kia ora, everyone. It's level 2. Woohoo! We can get out and do some of that stuff that we have been missing for the past 7 weeks, and a great opportunity to be able to catch up with family members in different parts of the city and different parts of the country. It's going to be really, really cool. And schools all going to be back on Monday as well, which is very, very exciting. All right, today we're going to read a couple of stories from Cat's Whiskers. We're going to do Slinky Malinky today. Now, I've actually realised that I'm not too far off actually finishing George's Marvellous Medicine. So we might just do a short bit of the George's Marvellous Medicine today, and then we can finish it off tomorrow. But firstly, we'll do a Slinky Malinky story from Linley Dodd, who does all the Harry McCleary ones. And then we'll do a bit more of George's Marvellous Medicine. So it'll be a bit of a shorter story time today, but hey, that's okay. That's all good. So here we go. Slinky Malinky was blacker than black, a stalking and lurking adventurous cat. He had bright yellow eyes and a warbling wail and a kink at the end of his very long tail. He was cheeky and cheerful, friendly and fun. He'd chase after leaves and he'd roll in the sun. But at night he was wicked and fiendish and sly. Through moonlight and shadow he'd prowl and he'd pry. He crept along fences, he leapt over walls, he poked into corners and sneaked into halls. What was he up to at night, to be brief? Slinky Malinky turned into a thief. All over the town, from basket and bowl, he pilfered and pillaged, he snitched and he stole slippers and sausages, biscuits and balloons, brushes and bandages, pencils and spoons. He pulled them, he dragged them, he heaved them until he carried them home to his house on the hill. One rascally night between midnight and 4, Slinky Malinky stole more than before. Some pigs and a teddy bear dressed up in lace, a gardening glove from a cafete's place, a tatty old sneaker, a smelly old sock, and Jennifer Turkington's pottery smock. A squishy banana, some glue and a pen, a cushion from Oliver Tulliver's den. A clock and some bottles, a pair of blue jeans, a half-knitted jersey, a packet of beans. He pulled them, he dragged them, he heaved them until he carried them home to his house on the hill. And then Slinky Malinky, rapscallion cat, piled them up high in a heap on the mat. The glue toppled over and gummed up the pigs. The jersey unraveled and tangled his legs. He tripped on the bottles and slipped on the sock. He tipped over sideways and set off the clock. Crash went the bottles. Beep, beep went the clock. Went the dogs on the block. On went the lights. Bang went the door, and out came the family. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh no! They all cried. What a criminal cat! Tomorrow we'll have to take everything back. With a tangled up middle and glue on his face, Slinky Malinky was deep in disgrace. Never again did he answer the call when moon shadows danced over garden and wall. When whispers of wickedness stirred in his head, he adjusted his whiskers and stayed home instead. All right, we are going to carry on a little bit with George's Marvellous Medicine. You remember that yesterday they tried making them a second dose of medicine, and it didn't work quite well because it was missing some things. So now we're going to find out about Marvellous Medicine number 3. Here it is, cried Mr. Killycranky, rushing into the kitchen. 1 carton of flea powder for dogs and 1 tin of brown house shoe polish. George poured the flea powder into the giant saucepan. Then he scooped the shoe polish out of its tin and added that as well. Stir it up, George, shouted Mr. Cranky. Give it another boil. We'll get it right this time. I bet we've got it. After Marvellous Medicine number 3 had been boiled and stirred, George took a cupful of it and ran out into the yard to try it on another chicken. Mr. Cranky ran after him, flapping his arms and hopping with excitement. Come and watch this one, he cried to Mrs. Cranky. Come and watch us turn an ordinary chicken into a lovely great big one that lays eggs as large as footballs. I hope you do better than last time, said Mrs. Cranky, following them out. Come on, chicken, said George, holding out a spoonful of medicine number 3. Good, chicken, chick, 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 chick. Have some of this lovely medicine. A magnificent black cockerel with a scarlet comb came over. The cockerel looked at the spoon and it went peck. Cock-a-doodle-doo, squawked the cockerel, shooting up into the air and coming down again. Watch him now, cried Mr. Cranky. Watch him grow any minute. He's going to start getting bigger and bigger. Mr. Killy Cranky, Mrs. Cranky, and little George stood in the yard staring at the black cockerel. The cockerel stood quite still. It looked as though it had a headache. What's happening to its neck? Mrs. Cranky said. It's getting longer, George said. I'll say it's getting longer, Mrs. Cranky said. Mr. Cranky, for once, said nothing. Last time it was the legs, Mrs. Cranky said. Now it's the neck. Who wants a chicken with a long neck? You can't eat a chicken's neck. It was an extraordinary sight. The cockerel's body hadn't grown at all, but the neck was now 6 feet long. All right, George, Mr. Cranky said. What else have you forgotten? I don't know, George said. Oh, yes, you do, Mr. Cranky said. Come along, boy, think. There's probably one vital thing that you're missing. You've got to remember. I put in some engine oil from the garage, George said. Did you have that on your list? Eureka, shouted Mr. Cranky. That's the answer. How much did you put in? Half a pint, George said. Mr. Cranky ran to the garage and found another half pint of oil. And some antifreeze, George called after him. I sloshed in a bit of antifreeze. George's Marvellous Medicine number 4. Back in the kitchen, once again, George, with Mr. Cranky watching him anxiously, tipped half a pint of engine oil and some antifreeze into the giant saucepan. Boil it up again, cried Mr. Cranky. Boil it and stir it. George boiled it and stirred it. You'll never get it right, said Mrs. Cranky. Don't forget, you don't just have to have the same things. You've got to have exactly the same amount of those things. How can you possibly do that? You keep out of this, cried Mr. Cranky. We're doing fine. We've got it this time. You see if we haven't. This was George's Marvellous Medicine number 4. When it had boiled for a couple of minutes, George once again carried a cupful of it out into the yard. Mr. Cranky ran after him. Mrs. Cranky followed more slowly. You're going to have some mighty queer-looking chickens around here if you go on like this, she said. Dish it out, George, cried Mr. Cranky. Give it a spoonful to the one over there. He pointed to a brown hen. George knelt down and held out a spoon with the new medicine in it. Chick, chick, he said. Try some of this. The brown hen walked over and looked at the spoon. Then it went peck. Meow, it said. And a funny whistling noise came from its beak. Watch it grow, shouted Mr. Cranky. Don't be too sure, said Mrs. Cranky. Why is it whistling like that? Keep quiet, woman, cried Mr. Cranky. Give it a chance. They stood there staring at the brown hen. It's getting smaller, George said. Look at it, Dad. It's shrinking. And indeed it was. In less than a minute, the hen had shrunk so much it was no longer than a newly hatched chick. It looked ridiculous. Tiny little chicken down there. I'm just having a look. Ooh, we could almost finish the story. Why not? Why not finish it off? All right. Goodbye, Grandma, is the next chapter. There's still something you left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it would be, George said. Give it up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in. You'll never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with a spoon in one hand and the cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the 3 people below her. She shouted, What's going on here? Why hasn't anyone bought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough to have to sleep in the yard with the rats and the mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve. No tea, no eggs, no bacon, no buttered toast. I'm sorry, Mother, Mrs. Cranky said. We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away. Let George get the lazy little brute, Grandma shouted. Just then, the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. Oh, she cried. Aha, so that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself, all right, don't you? You make sure that you've got a nice morning cup of tea, but you don't think to bring one for your poor old grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig. No, Grandma, George said, this isn't Don't lie to me, boy, the enormous old hag shouted. Pass it up here this minute. No, cried Mrs. Cranky. No, Mother, don't. That's not for you. And now you're against me too, shouted Grandma. My own daughter trying to stop me from having my breakfast, trying to starve me out. Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and he smiled sweetly. Of course it's for you, Grandma. So you take it and drink it while it's nice and hot. Don't think I won't, Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reached out a huge horny hand for the cup. Hand it over, George. No, no, Grandma, George cried out, pulling the cup away. You mustn't. You must not have it. Give it to me, boy, yelled Grandma. Don't, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's George's marvellous. Everything's George's round here, shouted Grandma. George this, George that. I'm fed up with it. She snatched the cup out of little George's hand and carried it high out of reach. Drink it up, Grandma, Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. Lovely tea. No, the other two cried. No, no, no. But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp, she swallowed everything that was in it. Mother, wailed Mrs. Cranky, you've just drank 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine number 4, and look what one tiny spoonful did to the little old brown hen. But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she began to whistle. This is going to be interesting, Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. You've done it, cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. You cooked the old girl's goose. I didn't do anything, Mr. Cranky said. Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it. A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth, nose, and ears, and whistling as it came. She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam, Mr. Cranky said. She's going to blow up, Mrs. Cranky wailed. The boiler's going to burst. Stand clear, Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt their ears. Call the fire brigade, cried Mrs. Cranky. Call the police, man the hose pipes. Too late, said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. Grandma, shrieked Mrs. Cranky. Mother, run to the drinking trough, put your head under the water. But even as she spoke, and whistling suddenly stopped, and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She had started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, and now she was coming down fast. What's this, George? Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard, flapping his arms. Watch what happens when someone had 50 spoonfuls instead of 1. Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. Stop, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's just right. But she didn't stop. She got smaller and smaller and smaller. Down, down, down she went. In another half-minute, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. How do you feel, Mother? Asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it had always had. Her eyes no bigger now than little keyholes were blazing with anger. How do I feel? She yelled. How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious child a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget? She's still going, shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. She's still getting smaller. And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hand and she cried, How do I stop her from getting smaller still? You can't, said Mr. Cranky. She's had 50 times the right amount. I must stop her, Mrs. Cranky wailed. I can hardly see her at all. Catch hold of each end and pull, Mr. Cranky said. By then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then you can see her shrinking. Where is she? Cried Mrs. Cranky. I've lost her. Hooray, said Mr. Cranky. She's gone. She's completely disappeared, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's what happens if you're grumpy and bad-tempered, said Mr. Cranky. Great medicine of yours, George. George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you gone to? How can I find you? But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, well, suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she? Yes, Mr. Cranky said, she most certainly was. George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place this morning, and for a few brief moments he had touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of a magic world. And that is the end of the story. Well, there's some lots of, gotta love Roald Dahl's stories. Always interesting, using some great describing and lots of fun. Well, that's all for today. We have finished George's Marvellous Medicine, so we won't be starting another novel tomorrow, but we will do some more stories tomorrow, which will be our final Tawa School story time as we all head back to school on Monday. Anyway, I'll catch up with you tomorrow. Ka kite anō.